Hi, good morning and good afternoon. This is Shiming Chair from the National Immigration Law Center. Thank you for joining our webinar today to talk about Trump's Muslim ban and the various responses to the ban, ranging from legal to community responses. It's been a whirlwind of a weekend starting from Friday night, so we are very happy to have with us several people who can break down what the order says, talk about the litigation that's currently underway to challenge parts of the order, and we're also joined by some special guests from organizations that have been on the ground really fighting for different communities. One of them is Fahad Ahmed from DRUM, Justice Rising Up and Moving from New York. And we're also joined by Lika Vafai from Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. So please do type your questions into the box. What we're going to do is take some questions after the first two sections. So if you have any questions about the legal challenges in particular, start typing them into the box. And please rest assured that we will send you a copy of the PowerPoint and a link to the recording either tomorrow or Wednesday. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Avide Musavian, who's going to review what the executive order actually does and says.
Thanks, Jiming. I'm Avide Musavian. I'm with the National Immigration Law Center. I'm a policy attorney based out of our Washington, D.C. office. I'm just going to give you all a brief recap of what the content of Friday's executive order is. Many of you have seen copies of it, perhaps, although it's not currently posted on the White House website. Some of the most major changes and significant changes are, number one, a drastic reduction in this fiscal year's number of refugees that will be admitted. So previously it was the cap was at 110,000. That number has been now reduced to 50,000. Just by way of brief context, about half of the refugees that we accepted in 2016 were from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, and Burma. Some other countries include Iraq, Somalia, Bhutan, Iran, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Eritrea. There is currently an indefinite bar on the entire Syrian refugee resettlement and a 120-day suspension of the entire refugee admissions program, subject to review. There are some exceptions that have been allowed for on a case-by-case basis. What I'm describing to you is what's in the written language. That's obviously, as you'll hear from the other presenters, quite different from both interpretation by the government that's been issued as well as the reality of what we are hearing on the ground and seeing on the ground and documenting on the ground. But in theory, the case-by-case exceptions are if it's in the national interest to admit the refugee, if there's no risk that's posed by the individual, if they're a religious minority facing religious persecution. The president has particularly emphasized Christian refugees. If there's a requirement for the U.S. government to allow someone in according to international agreement, or this last exception was negotiated basically to address the fact that there were people in transit on Friday while the order was being signed and put into effect. So anyone who was in transit and would suffer a hardship from it. As again, the future speakers on the call will provide more detail about, we've obviously seen that there were enormous problems in making sure that the folks in transit were actually protected. On the next slide, this is a description of the third suspended element of entries. That's for nationals from 7 Muslim majority countries. It calls for the exclusion of people who are from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. And this includes people who are dual nationals, people who have valid non-immigrant visas. As of last night, there was clarification that was issued by the Department of Homeland Security saying that lawful permanent residents or green card holders wouldn't be subject to this 90-day ban because they deemed it to be in the national interest. again, many of the lawsuits and experiences on the ground have documented that that's not in fact been the position that CBP has taken in terms of how they've treated people who are entering as with immigrant visas or as lawful permanent residents who are re-entering. It's possible for other countries in the future to be designated and added to this list, because the list essentially comes from Department of Homeland Security and Department of State, and specifically the list for those who have been wondering where does the list come from, it's from prior designation under the last administration after the passage of a visa waiver reform bill. So the fear is, of course, that there could be additional countries that are added to this list. Finally, just on the next slide, additional changes that the executive order would impose are a very onerous requirement of interviews for most non-immigrant visa applicants from abroad. This would mean that they would have to do in-person interviews. It would obviously create a tremendous backlog in terms of adjudication of the visa applications, and we expect a real bureaucratic backlog as a result of that, and real concerns about what type of questions will be posed during the interviews. And additionally, a requirement that anyone who is seeking an immigration benefit is screened specifically for any determination around their likelihood of becoming a positively contributing member of society or their ability to make contributions in the national interest. Again, the language here is overly broad and disconcerting because we expect that it will create undue burdens for people who are applying, and will create delays in terms of the adjudications of people applying for any type of immigration benefit if they or a derivative are particularly from one of those 7 listed countries. So that's a recap, and again, I just want to really emphasize what we're about to hear from the other presenters is that this is how the order is written. There's a lot of uncertainty around some of the meaning of it, but what we've certainly seen is that the application of it has been inconsistent even with some of the language that's in the order. So I will hand it off to Karen to talk a little bit more about the legal aspects of the response.
Great. So thank you everybody for joining. I have to say that after this weekend, like many of you, I'm tired, but I'm also just so encouraged by the way that so many people have worked to push back against this disgusting and shameful executive order that was issued in the evening of Friday. So my role is, and it's a total delight, is to share a little bit about the lawsuit. And I'm going to share a bit about the lawsuit that we're involved in, but also some of the other amazing lawsuits that have been filed in the last, whatever it's only been, right, 60 hours. So let me share a little bit about the lawsuit that the National Immigration Law Center is so lucky to be a part of, along with the ACLU, Immigrants' Rights Project, the International Refugee Assistance Project at the Urban Justice Center, and also critically the Worker and Immigrants' Rights Advocacy Clinic at the Yale Law School. So we got reports from IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project, literally within about I would say 2 hours of the executive order being signed, because they, of course, knew this could be coming and were monitoring every single one of the flights of their clients inbound from any of these countries. And they knew that our 2 clients were being held at LAX. So we all sprung into high gear and did a ridiculous amount of, agitation at JFK. IRAP was on site immediately and had been there waiting and just trying to figure out what was happening. And as soon as we could confirm that indeed the executive order was being applied, and that's the only reason why these individuals' valid visas were not being accepted, we made an immediate decision to start drafting the habeas petition. And our concern was, oh my goodness, we know about these 2 guys, what is happening everywhere else? And we knew that our 2 clients were being threatened with being put on flights, and they told us the flight information hours later. So we had only a few hours to work with. We filed the suit, and we also filed a motion for class action because we were deeply concerned that we could essentially have a group of individuals that were disappeared over the weekend if we didn't get recourse. So really happy to say, and I think most folks kind of know what then played out. We did a lot of agitation. We filed that in the wee hours of Saturday. I think it was about 5:43 Eastern time when we filed the habeas and the motion for class cert. A couple hours later, we decided that we needed to take aggressive action to try to get a hearing and a resolution of our request to stop all deportations under the executive order nationwide. We filed a motion for what's called a stay of removal to try to agitate and get that done. And we're delighted when the judge gave us about an hour's notice for a hearing on Saturday in Brooklyn. Folks know the result of that hearing is that there was an immediate nationwide injunction ordered. And here's the critical piece. It is on the removal of anyone under the executive order nationwide. So it doesn't address all the problems, right? This particular order and that Avide, my colleague, was describing. So for example, we have reports of folks, and many of you do too, who were in transit, in their way to the United States with valid visas, got stopped somewhere like London when they are in transit, and were being picked off of planes. We don't yet have a remedy in place for those folks who may be stranded in other countries or may be terrified to now attempt to get on a plane to come to the U.S. So I want to flag that. We, as a critically, however, as a part of this case, we are supposed to be getting a list of information of folks who are detained nationwide under the executive order, and we are agitating with opposing counsel to get that soon because that will help us all make sure that folks' rights are being protected. I just want to say, I want to say a word about the other cases that were also filed because it's just been so incredibly needed. I'll start with the Boston case that was filed by the ACLU at minimum in Massachusetts. I actually don't know if there's other co-counsel on that case. One amazing thing about this, so it focuses on the Boston Logan Airport and also protects people from being removed. So what was happening is a handful of courts on Saturday were considering emergency habeases that were filed across the country. Critical piece in Boston, however, is, okay, if you can't remove folks based on this executive order right now until courts figure out the legality of the executive order, which we all think is illegal, how long can you hold someone and how long can you interrogate them under this executive order? So there is a piece in the Boston order that prohibits detention of folks under the executive order. Now, how that'll be interpreted is an open question, but it's a wonderful hook that we are all going to try to expand across the country. Because here is what we don't want, right? We don't want an individual coming in from one of these countries with a valid visa. They know they can't be deported, but yet, and we've seen this, right? There was a couple in San Francisco who was questioned for upwards of 20 hours after they landed before they were finally released. That's outrageous. So then I also want to flag the case that was filed in Alexandria, Virginia, covering Dulles. Great work there by Mayor Brown and the Virginia Justice Center. They were particularly outraged and disturbed by the fact that when these armies of advocates and lawyers were showing up at airports all across the country demanding to know what was happening with people who were being detained under the executive order, Border Patrol would give them no information, right? No number to call, no information, nothing, just a black box of no counsel. And so they sought on an emergency basis a ruling from a court that said there has to be some provision of information to this counsel who's literally standing outside while folks are being interrogated and maybe being put on a plane. And then last, I'll just flag, both in Seattle, an individual habeas was filed in order to make sure that folks weren't deported, successfully resolved, and a really important case out of Los Angeles filed at, I don't know all the parties who were on the papers, but I know the ACLU of Southern California is, the Law Office of States v. Tolchen. Again, an individual habeas on behalf of someone, in this case, who was actually deported under the executive order, and when he got to the first country outside was held in detention and beaten. The judge last night ordered his return to the United States because he was illegally removed under this executive order. Huge case, and we want to make sure that there's absolutely no one nationwide who has been removed between Friday and when the nationwide injunction went into place under the executive order. And if they were, make sure that we can get orders just like this and have them all brought back. So I think that gives you a lay of land of really the lawsuits, but I just want to take off some of the issues, which is separate than the litigation. What has been so important has been the outpouring of support and really one-on-one troubleshooting and legal support to folks in different categories who were already being affected by the executive order. So first, people being stopped in countries outside of the United States, told by airlines, both airlines and by U.S. Immigration officials, that they cannot board the plane inbound to the United States. Clearly, the executive order has gone far and wide to the airline industry and to border officials in other countries, and they are putting up the big fat red flag and not letting folks from these 7 countries even on the plane. Folks who have been forced to turn back, as I mentioned before, who've gotten partway in their journey and are either stranded there or sent back, sometimes in cases to countries they left because they had refugee status and therefore are afraid to be in. And the detention, of course, at U.S. airports. Even with the injunction in place, the question is how much questioning and how aggressive is this quote-unquote extreme vetting that's happening under the executive order. Last thing to flag is we have heard really disturbing reports as folks are being held for 1, 2, 5, 20 hours in secondary screening at airports in the United States, that they are being asked to sign documents they don't understand. Deeply concerned about that. We've now also heard reports of people being asked to sign documents on airplanes when they're getting turned around or either have been on an airplane and then, through advocacy, they finally get off. When they come out, they tell us, they handed me these documents they said I had to sign. So all of this is to say an enormous thanks to so many people across the country who are responding. Those of you who are on the call and have been at airports, I hope that we all continue to monitor what happens in the next days at the airports too, and really make sure we stay united through all of these actions to make sure that we take this executive order off totally down.
All right, thank you, Karen, and also Avane. So if people have questions for those two presenters, please do put them into the text box, the question box on the webinar technology. We do have some coming in. The first one's for you, Avane. We're hearing this morning that all the I-forms that are submitted to USCIS from the 7 countries will be put on hold. Is that correct?
So we've heard mixed reports around, but generally speaking, that there's a concern that a lot of applications will be delayed if they are filed by a national of that country, or if there's a derivative of one of the 7 countries, or if there's a derivative from one of those 7 countries who's a beneficiary of the application. So that includes both for people who are beneficiaries here, or of course people who are in following to join type petitions where the family member is outside of the country.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question about what do you two advise to people outside the country who are thinking of flying to the U.S.? They're specifically asking about lawful permanent residents, but maybe it could be a little bit broader. In general, what are you suggesting?
So, I mean, the way I would do this if I was talking to, if it was my loved one who had a valid visa, is I would, number one, I think that anybody who's coming in right now needs to have a plan in place. Meaning, I think they need to have not only somebody who's at the airport to greet them, to meet them and monitor how long they are held, because, as I said, Boston has the biggest kind of protection in the sense that at least there's something in their court order that goes to detention, but it doesn't say like you can only be questioned for an hour, right? And we continue to hear of this ridiculously long time where there's questioning often in, when people are exhausted, not in hospitable circumstances, and often when it's coercive. So I think that for folks who, need to be advised about what is the current state of what we're seeing, particularly at the airport that they are going to be arriving in, they need to have a plan in place to have someone who is connected to the various legal responses happening at those airports, and also potentially to the cases kind of tapped in and know that they're coming. We're tracking as much as we can our legal team, since our injunction is nationwide, as many of these that we can. We have a small subgroup of our team when we get an inbound request of somebody who's traveling in to see who's going to be at the airport and who could be there, and many others are doing that too. So that would be my advice.
Great. And then there's a question about clarifying which lawsuits apply nationwide and which don't, and clarifying how long the injunction from the New York lawsuit is good for and what the process will be to get it extended.
So right now, the only lawsuit that clearly applies nationwide is our lawsuit with the other actors in New York. That was actually clarified, believe it or not, even though the judge said several times in ruling that it was nationwide. We had to fight for several hours afterwards, and there's a second clarification that was filed that it is indeed nationwide. So that is the one that's nationwide. The others generally cover their own airport areas.
All right, thank you. And Avide, there's a question about repeating how the 7 countries were selected. If you could repeat that and just give a little more background again.
Yeah, just briefly, there were changes that were imposed on the visa waiver program in 2015 in the last administration that allowed for DHS and Department of State to designate certain countries if they deemed it to be for security reasons to provide to require those countries and including dual nationals of those countries to go through additional screening. And so the list of those countries has already been previously used for other extra requirements for nationals and dual nationals of those countries. So I think for some people, you know, they've been wondering what is the nexus between the list of the 7 countries and September 11th or the other sort of purported intent behind designating these countries. And so I just wanted to briefly touch on the fact that unfortunately this list had been previously in existence, not for these same types of restrictions obviously, but that's where that comes from. And again, the concern is we don't know what will happen for any of the 3 categories of halts or suspensions on the Syrians, on the refugee resettlement program overall, and then also for those who are from these 7 countries. We don't know if the 90-day and the 120-day suspensions will continue. We don't know if additional countries will be designated and added, but that's the background on those 7 countries.
Thanks. And then for Karen, in the Brooklyn case, there's a question about why the order only prohibits removal. So are there plans to extend that to prohibit detention and also compelling access to counsel?
So the Brooklyn case only literally, the reason why we were focused on removal at the time we filed was, I mean, like literally my hands were shaking when we were filing the court documents because we thought that our clients were potentially minutes away from being sent back to Iraq, and we thought they were actually potentially on a plane at that moment. And so there just wasn't enough time to incorporate additional things at that time and be assured that we would get on file before our clients and others like them were removed. We have already begun to make additional requests in that case, and we'll continue, and that's why we've been working with folks around the country. Now that we know we have nationwide coverage, what else can we do, what else should we do, but also very much coordinating with the other really important lawsuits that have been filed to figure out what are the ways that we can coordinate this all together and get the most protection for the most people, leveraging all the work that's being done against this executive order.
There's a question for either of you. What steps are you taking, I think for NILC and also other organizations taking to address CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol agents' refusal to obey the court orders?
Karen, I can speak from,
that'd be great.
Answer and let you add. I think for a lot of folks, I think what people's experiences in the airports were actually having members of Congress physically appear and essentially, I hate to use the word negotiate because it was really just like ensuring their compliance rather than actually negotiating something. It was that making sure that CBP was honoring the decision. So I think for a lot of people, just calling on their members of Congress to demand CBP comply with the order, to demand that they release information about anyone who is held, that they ensure that people have access to attorneys. So I think that kind of what you can do as a, you know, in terms of advocacy is reaching out to your members of Congress to make that call on them. But that's been one point of pressure. And then Karen, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that, you know, this is really key, right? And I think that what we've all been doing is just, you know, considering that it's entirely essential to be working with each kind of airport, right, and make sure that the, you know, that the field office director who is in charge of that airport is clear that the, you know, whatever injunction or injunctions are in place that cover that airport, and that there's literally some systems that are pushed for locally in terms of what is the process going to be with attorneys and critically family members, right? We can't imagine that everyone coming in is going to have a attorney who's waiting for them, right? But their family may be there, and their family deserves rights to know what is happening when people are being held for hours. So I think we just have to keep pushing on the local end, and I love the suggestion. And I would just echo that, you know, at airports across the country, yesterday, the day before, local officials and elected officials have been coming out and adding their voice to demand, you know, this is crazy. We have to have information on these folks in Border Patrol. You have to be responsive. So I think that we just need to keep the pressure up.
All right, thank you. We're getting a lot of questions about what people can do in response and how to support these efforts. So that's actually the perfect segue for us to go to our next presenter, who is Fahad Ahmed, the director of DRUM, Justice Rising Up and Moving in New York City, who they've done a lot of really phenomenal work over the years in terms of intersectional solidarity as well as international solidarity. So Fahad, I'm hoping you can give more of a little bit of a historical context to what's happening, and then also talk about some of the on-the-ground responses that have been going on.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Greetings, everybody. My name is Fahad Ahmed. I am the director of DRUM, Justice Rising Up and Moving. We are a membership-based organization of low-income South Asian immigrant workers and youth in New York City. We are a 16-year-old organization. We were formed in 2000. And we were one of the first organizations to respond in the aftermath of 9/11. At that period, similar to now, you know, we saw a major crisis unfolding within our communities. There was people being picked up in sweeps. You know, we started getting calls from families saying, my husband left for work 4 days ago, he hasn't come home, or police and immigration came to our house last night and took my brother away. Or a van just pulled up outside a workplace, grabbed 3 people and drove off. And you know, we responded to those sweeps by sort of visiting inside of prisons, by working with the families on the outside. And one of the key things that we did from very early on was to really draw upon both the support, but also the history and lessons of people from across multiple movements. And so, in particular, in this period when, you know, massive attacks were happening on Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and broadly immigrant communities, our key allies and key partners were actually not from within our communities. They were actually people from the police, anti-police brutality movement, and from prisoners' rights or prison abolition movements. And I think it was really that those partnerships really helped us understand the nature of state violence, the nature of how all of these issues are interconnected, how laws that are intended to target one community are built upon and expanded to target other communities. And so, you know, when the activism and the organizing was happening, you know, the people that were showing up not only to protest, but going inside to visit prisons, and then doing the advocacy work, were also from across these multiple movements. I think, now, and then in the aftermath of 9/11, we saw several policies. In the beginning, it was mentioned that there was this Muslim registrations program that was set up. It targeted people from, I think, 26 Muslim majority countries, plus North Korea thrown in for the diversity factor. And 83,000 people at least registered. At least 13,000 were put into deportation proceedings. And again, we worked with a lot of those people when they were in prisons and worked with their families. And after the sweeps and the registrations, we saw sort of the expansion of the surveillance network that targeted domestic communities here as well. Once the Obama administration came in, there was, in some ways, there was a sense that some of the policies were toned down. But what we actually saw was that they were just kind of change into soft targeting. And so whereas before under the Bush administration, it was a lot more use of heavy surveillance, the use of raids at mosques, at people's homes, the use of undercovers and informants to fabricate and manufacture terrorism cases. Under the Obama administration, we saw a shift towards a program called Countering Violent Extremism, which tried to get the education department, health professionals to become part of the surveillance apparatus. That if they see something suspicious, that they should report it, signs of radicalization, signs of what they think were people inching towards extremism. And now the current administration inherits a lot of the infrastructure that has been built up over the past 14, 15 years. And as was mentioned, the listing of the 7 countries that's there now builds upon that. And I think, so then the last point I wanted to sort of really highlight is because throughout the process we've always been thoughtful around how do these issues link across our movements, across communities, and that communities in quotes. How many of these refugees are also folks who may be LGBTQ? How many of, how are women in particular being affected? There's all these nuances that happen when any community is under attack. It's not like women are separate from Muslim, are separate from LGBTQ, are separate from Black. Our communities are, our identities are overlapping. And so that provides one natural way of linking across movements, linking across issues. And then I think the work that's been done over the last 14, 15 years to build relationships across organizations has also been very helpful. By Friday night, when we started getting reports that people were being stopped, we, in collaboration with the New York Immigration Coalition and Make the Road New York, on Saturday morning put out a call for people to show up to JFK Airport. And the first wave of folks were obviously people that were from our organizations or closely affiliated to us. But that in itself provided enough of a boost that then other allies, other individual activists, and people from across the city were able to see it and started coming out. And at its peak, we had close to 10,000 people. And then I think just the last point I would say is, in this moment, what's important is that people, it's good when we have people coming out to mobilizations, but really that building of relationships across movements, across organizations, it only happens, and to be able to have long-term sustainability, only happens when people are a part of organizations. Because organizations are able to sort of, sustain themselves, sustain those relationships, and coordinate those efforts. Versus individual activists kind of just are stuck having to jump around from action to action. So our main call would be that if you're not already a part of an organization, join an existing one. If there isn't an existing one that suits your perspectives, then create one. And in this period, we're going to need as many people involved for the long run. for the long haul. I'll stop there for now.
All right. Thank you, Fahad. And also we included the photos you shared from outside JFK. Do you want to say anything about what happened there over the weekend?
Yeah. So, on Saturday when I think we put the call out maybe around 11 a.m. It was just like a Facebook event page, and I think probably went out on Twitter as well. We showed up around 1 o'clock, and maybe at 2 o'clock it was maybe about 100 people. About 4 o'clock it was maybe 500 people. By 5 o'clock it was maybe 1,000 people. And by 6 o'clock we were above like 5,000 people. And by 7 or 8 o'clock it was above 10,000 people. And there was I've been doing this work for 16 years. There was it's just always beautiful to see a lot of people come out. But there's something really, really beautiful about the sense of community that existed there. There was people that, from Long Island or from other places that weren't even at the protest that called in orders for food delivery. And there was pizza boxes being delivered by the dozens to feed the protesters. People bringing in water, people bringing in snacks, people sharing food, people providing first aid support to each other. And I think for us, a lot of what we've been thinking about is, in this current moment, we're not dealing with forces, who are pursuing bad policies. These are people that are ideologically driven. They have an agenda of white supremacy, of corporatism, of bigotry, of misogyny, of racism, of xenophobia. And so when in the face of the ugliness that they present, it is incumbent upon us to demonstrate the beauty of what love looks like, what solidarity looks like, what community looks like. And I think it's really, in this moment, we really have to think, not just responding to the current crises alone, but also really thinking about, is this a moment for us to rethink how we relate to each other as human beings, as communities, and really start to build and implement a vision of what real communities, what real love, and what real solidarity looks like.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you, Fahad. So now we're going to hear from Alika from Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, who's been doing really tremendous work on the West Coast around these issues. So if you just want to share some of the legal and the organizing and policy responses that you've been engaged in, Alika.
Sure. Thanks so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. So my name is Alika. As Shumi mentioned, I'm a staff attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, which is a civil rights-based organization here in the Bay Area, but we're also part of the larger affiliate, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, with the LA office, Chicago, DC, and Georgia. So really it's a large group of organizations, both legal and community, that have been responding together, kind of similar to what Fahad was saying in New York. But I think what, the first component was that we really saw Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian organizations, AMAMSA groups, that were connected to community, really being the kind of the community's first responder. So, similar to DRUM, what we were seeing was just even an hour after the executive order was dropped, folks, at Asian Law Caucus, and then we worked really closely with Council on American Islamic Relations, SSA area. We started getting so many calls from community and family members. It started with folks who were in transit, family members who were in transit, and folks who were planning to travel immediately. But I would say Saturday by like 7 a.m., there was just an overflow of inquiries, so we had to build a triage system pretty quickly. Our organization happened to work really closely with Rafabilu and CARE, through old infrastructures that we have for our joint work. And we quickly made a few community KYR bullet points in English, Arabic, and Farsi, because there was just quite a number of calls coming through. So part of the goal was really to get information out to the community who was calling, and information out to the broader community to get information about who was coming into the airport beforehand, because I think in a few cases, folks were able to get, a G28 or at minimum advise folks who were coming in, travelers who were coming in, not to sign any information, that this executive order has dropped and here's the phone number of an attorney. And that was kind of the mechanism to monitor a few of the cases. And then similarly, because the legal landscape was just changing so quickly, that gave a mechanism to let folks know about updates and changes quickly. So for example, the clarification around the lawful permanent resident issue, and trying to see who they were detaining and deporting, who they were detaining and trying to deport and not. So really focusing on community updates in real time because of those fast legal landscape changes. SFO, which is pretty much where we were based out of, really the same sentiments and sense of community that Fahad was explaining at JFK. It was just hacked slowly over time, building similarly in terms of attorneys, community members, volunteers, and it kind of became a question of coordinating volunteers with folks who knew community members who were coming in, family members who were coming in. So like the Iranian American Bar Association stepped up because of the high volume of Iranian cases. The National Lawyers Guild, both in terms of their immigration section and legal observers, ALED, and the list just goes on. So the legal component, I think, was critical, but the community component and the protests that were happening at SFO were really, really important, both in terms of solidarity and the sense that it gave the travelers as well. From the legal trend perspective, similar to what Karen and other folks have shared, we really noticed the extraordinary amount of time that it was taking for folks to get through, and really the lack of clear information about CBP, about clients and family coming through, and really not being responsive to attorneys at all. So in cases where the clients or family member has the phones with them, we were able to communicate. But, in the cases where the family didn't have phones, there was just no way to access them, and that became a quick hurdle as well. It also became clear pretty quickly after the order came down that there wasn't compliance occurring. And so, really working with law school clinics and local ACLU affiliates on possible habeas petitions. I'm not sure if any were filed because there were quite a few that were released, but the flights are keep coming in, so it's like this ongoing need for legal response and community response. There was one case that we worked on particularly with a coalition of groups where an elderly Iranian couple was detained for upward, around 30 hours. And the challenge was we couldn't get access to them, so definitely had to look at escalating it so that CBP would respond because we just couldn't get any information or speak with them. So escalating through media, getting elected officials in, although our experience was that not all the elected officials had the phone numbers, so figuring out how to coordinate that piece. And then, folks, particularly from Kamala Harris's office, did come down. But the trick is, with the filing of the petitions, making sure the hours worked in terms of the courts being open, et cetera. And so we really worked with CHAIR very, very closely on this, NILC, ACLU, NorCal, and the UC Davis Immigration Law Clinic. And I think the takeaway was just pursuing all avenues, legal, advocacy, whatever it took to get the clients out, which they were released again after about 30 hours. So by the time I left SFO yesterday, there was a portable printer in place, so much food, and it was just packed with community. I think there was also some great legal and community responses coming out of LAX. And I think moving forward, today what we're looking at is coordinating more and making sure that we're doing more of the KYR, particularly in the AMEMSA communities, the Know Your Rights piece, and making sure that we have templates to be able to move pretty quickly. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So there's quite a few questions coming in, and I know we won't be able to answer all of them. So we do include the speaker's contact information at the end, and I'll put up a picture of a campaign that Asian Americans Advancing Justice has been working on, 100 Days of Justice. And there's also instructions on this slide about how to create a solidarity selfie, which is one way for individuals just to show their support for refugees and immigrants and their opposition to a wall and opposition to a ban. So there's one question for either Fahad or Alika, or maybe both of you, which is, how can grassroots organizations support your efforts?
I can start. I think it really depends on the nature of the grassroots organizations. Probably I think that the best starting point is to reach out to the organizations that are working with impacted communities. So in this case, if we're talking about immigrants, refugees, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, reaching out to those organizations and figuring out how they could use support or where they would advise that particular organization to plug into. If people happen to be in an area where there aren't such organizations, then probably the next best option is to reach out to the legal and policy organizations and see kind of where they think they could use support. I think that, one of the things, and just to add on both to what I said earlier and some of the comments that were just made, is there is a very complementary relationship between the legal efforts and then the community efforts. Whatever legal petitions were filed, we believe that there is also an influence of pictures of thousands of people outside JFK Airport, outside LAX Airport, outside SFO Airport that had an impact on the legal decisions. People showing up to the courts makes a difference. And likewise, the community-based efforts, the community-led efforts often have a lot of legal support and backing that happens around keeping people safe, around protecting people that may get harassed or get arrested. And so, within that relationship, there's plenty of places for people to be able to plug into. But it's best to take the leadership of the folks that are already kind of doing that work.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I think, partnering with the impacted community org for sure. And I mean, just as an example, in the case of the Iranian elderly couple, I mean, there was a long several hours there where we didn't know if they were going to be put on a flight or not, and we weren't getting any responses. And as the legal piece was happening, we didn't just want to wait there, and there was a real coordination with the community orgs who were, organizing the chants and the protests, et cetera, and they were, we had text updates like, are they released, are they not, and helping to coordinate messaging around release, right, in conjunction with, and keeping the heat up as the legal documents were being prepared was really a great relationship. And I think that, the legal piece really can't move forward without the community component.
And for attorneys who are on the call and want to get involved, especially in terms of going to the airports, is there a point of contact for them, or how do they get involved?
I believe there's slowly infrastructure is developing. In New York, I think they set up a Twitter account, No Ban JFK, and they're coordinating legal volunteers, other volunteers, and interpreters. I believe the folks in all the other locations are also doing similarly.
Yeah, I can add to that. In California, One Justice is going to start coordinating the attorneys at the airport, so we can also send out their contact information with the slides.
Yeah, I think, as Fahad said, the infrastructures are building. Each airport is a little bit different, and there is coordination with the One Justice, but also, really being rooted in impacted communities, as that's where the community is going to as well. I think there's Excel sheets and sign-up sheets that are happening that are flying through. I've heard LAX is pretty coordinated. I'm not sure what that system is there.
Yeah, we really value everybody's willingness to get involved in some way possible. So yeah, please do contact some of the directly impacted organizations in your area. And then there's some questions that are geared towards the scope of the executive order. There's a couple of questions about whether this would affect temporary protected status or TPS from countries such as Yemen. So I don't know if Karen's still here too, if one of you want to tackle that question.
So, Alika, do you want to go first with your understanding? I think we're in one of these positions where the situation continues to evolve.
Yeah, similarly, I think it's an evolving piece.
Right. So I mean, for me, my take is, right, folks who, if TPS holders from Yemen would be here and inside the country, and my understanding is that they're coming up for reauthorization soon, right? So I think the big question is, what's behind this is, could there be further moves to not renew the status? So I think that's the real question. We'll have to wait and see, because with TPS right now, unless they got parole, advanced parole, they wouldn't be safe to leave the country and so wouldn't be facing this kind of interrogation. I think the other question that I'll just say is tricky, and Alika, you may have a different view on this, is there has also been questions about whether the executive order applies to dual citizens. So one place where it definitely should not apply, right, is if you're a U.S. citizen, but you also hold dual citizenship from one of the 7 countries. That should be clear, but I do want to flag that we're, everyone should be advocating to make sure that that's the understanding that Border Patrol has. The place that I think is much more confusing right now is whether or not, if you are, for example, a dual citizen of the United Kingdom and Iran, would you be subject to the executive order if you were attempting to enter the United States? And at first, it looked like the official line coming from DHS was yes. There's been some recanting of that position, but I personally have not seen it in writing in a way that is official enough to make it clear to me that we should be advising folks out of the country that they may not face interrogation under the executive order. So, Alika, I don't know if you have a different view on that or have seen a more official statement codifying any kind of exemption for dual citizens that are not U.S. citizens.
I don't think we've seen anything official, and I mean, I think for a lot of the organizations, multiple organizations that are on the ground, you kind of get the updates based on the trends of the cases that you're seeing, right? So I think for that dual citizens, I don't think that we've seen a clarity on that aspect of it. I think we're waiting either for the update or to see that case.
And there's a really good question about, do we think the executive order is constitutional? I mean, there's also other parts to get into in terms of whether it is the right direction for a country and whether it's moral, but this one is about its constitutionality. So I don't know if Alika, Fahad, do you have any thoughts?
I think with legal analysis, I'll defer to the attorneys, but I think we should do everything we can to fight back against it. I think we, as I mentioned earlier, we very much see this. This is just really them just getting started. This is the first step amongst a few other first steps in laying the groundwork to implement their vision of a bigoted, racist, corporatist society. And so we should use any and all tools that we have in our hands. If we can legally challenge it, that's good. If we need to just, continue to mobilize and put pressure and build across movements to make them the functioning for them under these with these types of policies impossible, then that's what we need to do. It really is, we really are looking at a struggle for a battle of values and what kind of vision for societies we see.
Yeah, I would echo that and love to hear Nelson's analysis of it also. I think like zoning in on one component of it, I think that the LPR, particularly the returning LPR piece, was really like a shocker. We working with the immigration folks as well on that component of it and trying to advise LPRs in that those first few hours was difficult because of the really divergence of law there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, my thoughts on this is really echoes what both Farhad and Alika have said. And I just, as horrible as this has been, right, there's that moment where you not just read the executive order, but you see it start to play out, right, both inside the country and outside, and the fear it creates. And I am literally moved in a way I haven't been moved, I don't know since when, by the response that has happened. Really, people on their feet across the country standing up. And I want us to take our advocacy efforts, whether they're in the courtroom or advocating with elected officials, to the next level and really figure out how we make what happened this weekend, which by my mind is big chunks of the United States standing up and saying, look, you come after one segment of the community and you're going to have to deal with us all. And do that on this issue, and not only this issue, but the other issues that this administration has rolled out that amount to nothing more than hate and xenophobia and targeting of certain groups and trying to roll back our rights. So I'm just really in gratitude for how folks have responded.
And we have about a minute left, so why don't the three of you share with us what you see happening next, either in terms of what other moves you think the government might be making, and also what kind of resistance you think we'll be seeing from on the ground. So we'll start with Alika.
Sure. I mean, I think I'm actually at SFL right now. I think what we're looking at, is increased solidarity, increased coordination, and really a centering on impacted communities, in this space, and then supporting other impacted communities as well, and getting the best know your rights and legal services out there as possible, and making sure that the community piece is centered in terms of the policy and the legal actions that move forward.
And Farhad?
I would echo that. I think there is a role for elected officials. We need to hold them to account as well. They can't continue to operate that this is just business as usual. Thinking around the cabinet selections, we should be pushing the elected officials to be part of the resistance and resist at every step. This is not an administration or a period where it's about wheeling and dealing across the aisle. And then I think on the ground, fundamentally, we have to look out for the safety and for the protection of our own communities. As much as possible, we're encouraging sort of neighborhood-level defense systems. Those also provide us an opportunity to build relationships across communities and to build solidarity with each other, and also to be able to build some of the infrastructure to be able to fight back from a neighborhood-based level, because that's where a lot of the attacks will also come. We're kind of using the framing of hate-free zones to build that out, but there's other people that are also doing similar things in the name of free zones, sanctuary neighborhoods, but really being able to actually have like some concrete defense and fight back infrastructure.
Thank you. So on that note, we will end this call. So thank you everybody who has joined us. Again, we will send you a link to the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint in the next 2 days. And especially a huge thanks to our presenters who have already been working tirelessly over the past weekend for really taking the time today to let people know what's happening and what they can do. So thank you all.
Thanks, Shameen.